All right, so I've been reading Plato's Republic, and one thing that I found pretty interesting is that it's a lot more conversational than I expected. I thought it was going to be some big fancy philosophical conversation using like words like, I don't know, objective phenomenology. But no, it's just like Socrates and a few of his friends talking about like what's justice about. And you know what? That's pretty cool. So today we are going to be discussing Plato's Republic. This is roughly going to be about book one, but like my translation is a little bit like wacky. So it's like going to be slightly after book one. So let's start off with Cephalus. So what Cephalus says, so basically, like the context of this is that they're trying to discuss justice, like what justice is, what it means to be just. Actually, in this entire section, I don't think they even defined what justice is. Actually, I think they did at the beginning, but like, they like, I feel like they should probably define what justice is if they're going to talk about it, but I think they only do that like once or twice. But anyhow, Cephalus, he doesn't like say what justice is. Socrates is the one who like gets it after him. Kind of similar to the Euthyphro, if you've ever read that. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. Okay, but I should probably start. So Cephalus is saying like, oh, justice is like when you borrow something, it's returning that to them. It's like telling the truth, being honest, and returning what you've taken. And like, sure, that's not a definition though. That's like an example. Kind of like in the Euthyphro, right? Where Euthyphro is like, "Oh, justice is throwing my father in prison." I mean, like that could be an example of justice or piety. That could be an example of piety, but that's not like what piety is. So I don't think these people really understand what they mean by definitions. But anyhow, so what Socrates says is he's like, oh, yeah, but you don't return in every single case. Like, let's say you're like, you borrow a weapon from your friend, right? And then the friend suddenly goes crazy and starts like spouting random nonsense. And you're like, maybe I shouldn't give back this weapon because that's probably not the best thing to do. And Cephalus is like, yeah, that's probably right. And then he just like leaves for some reason, which is like weird. A lot of these early people just like say one point, Socrates beats them, and then they leave. So I don't know, man. We need like stronger arguers. So next is Polemarchus. So Polemarchus, like his definition of justice is saying justice is giving what each person is owed. But that's different from Cephalus's. He says your friends, we want to help them, and your enemies, we want to harm them. And like, I guess that's a definition, but like it's very vague, right? Because I guess the most famous thing is like, what about the enemy of your enemy? Is that your friend? Like, you can't separate the world into just enemies and friends because there's more to that, right? It's only a partial order and not a total order, if I'm using my terms correctly. But yeah, I feel like this is just pretty standard in the ancient world because like duty and whatnot. We're gonna see like a lot of more duty arguments, like especially from Socrates. He talks about like function stuff a lot. But yeah, so like I just want to talk a little bit about this. Giving people what they're owed, I feel like that's just a really bad way to get about doing justice because that's inherently defining justice as individual, right? Because that's inherently saying, yeah, I'm your enemy. Because enemy is like like reciprocity. It's mutual, right? If I'm your enemy, then you're my enemy. So that means that necessarily, it's not just like, oh, it could be different from each person. It's necessarily different from each person. I say that it's wrong, like it's good to harm my enemy. My enemy says, oh no, it's bad to harm me. It's necessarily individualistic. So I'm not a huge fan of this argument, but yeah, I guess like this is like very common in like a lot of these ancient Greek literature pieces sprinkled throughout like Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad. Um really just used to justify like awful things like war and stuff, even in the modern day. But yeah, so Socrates, it's not hard to defeat this argument. Socrates can do it. So basically, what Polam Polemarchus, I don't know how to pronounce that. Polemarchus, like the argument is that okay, well, justice is like a skill, right? So every skill like has a domain in which that skill is useful. So like medicine, medicine is useful to cure illnesses. Navigation is used to go to the sea. Doing music is used to, I don't know what the realm of that skill was, but those are like the big three they always mention: medicine, navigation, and music. So they're saying like, oh, justice is useful only. Oh, sorry. So basically, Polemarchus is saying, um, like, okay, so where is justice useful in this case? Like, justice is a skill, right? So what's the domain of the skill? Polemarchus is saying the domain of justice is to guard things you aren't using. Okay, so he's basically saying, okay, yeah, justice in general is helping friends and harming enemies, but like for a specific example of like where the skill is used, it's like if I give you something, you should guard it. And make sure like be honest with it, right? Don't like give it to other people. Kind of like similar to Cephalus, I guess. So immediate objections come to mind, but one I don't really like Socrates' response to this. Socrates is saying like, "Oh, if you're good at guarding something, that means you're good at stealing something, right? Because like the person who knows the most about um the person who knows them it's like if you're like coding something, right? The person who coded the program probably knows the most about how to hack the program. But like is that I what? That doesn't even make any sense. I mean it makes sense, but like I feel like that's I don't know. I couldn't really put it into words, but um when you're saying that, right? Like the person who is guarding it necessarily is the person who's the best at stealing that. One that's kind of a non sequitur, right? You're saying like, "Oh, just because justice like implies the negative of justice because justice means that you have knowledge of what not to do with justice." Okay, so like isn't the problem that like that's the thing about justice is that you like do it even though you know that you could steal it. Maybe a misunderstanding, but I just don't find that argument very strong. Okay. So then like another problem with this, yeah, here's like the big problem, which I feel like this is the obvious why didn't you say this sooner? He's saying, okay, well, what if we don't know who our friends are, right? So we're saying like, okay, we don't know who our friends are, so we have to look at who seem like our friends, who seem good. And that's gonna come up later with like the whole, oh, we have to act just put on a veil of justice while in the meantime like we have to be unjust at heart, which is like an argument that some people try to make later. But yeah, that's like the huge issue. And one more thing that he says is that this is I do find this interesting actually. So they're saying like, okay, harming a thing makes it worse. So again, we're treating justice like a skill, right? So like horses, right? If you harm horses and like horsing can be a skill. What's the name? Horsing. There's a word for it, I know. Hold on, let me search it up. Equestrian. Yeah, okay, that's the thing. Equestrian. So like equestrianism, if you harm like the horses, they're like worse horses, right? But if you harm if you like harm the justice virtue, so if you like harm the human, they don't become like less just, right? So that proves that justice isn't like a skill. It's more of like a virtue, right? Justice is like transcends crafts. Justice transcends like all these things, and I do really like that because I think we're gonna see like more about that later. But one thing that I really like about these kind of ancient Greek philosophers is how they separate uniqueness in humanity. So I really like how Aristotle said something like, "Oh, we have like the one thing unique about humans is that we have a rational soul," and I do really like that. So I think what Plato's trying to do here is saying, okay, well, we have crafts, right? But anyone can do a craft. Like animals can do crafts. Monkeys can, not monkeys. Like beavers can build things, right? You can have crafts. But justice is fundamentally different from those crafts. And why is that? Because like taking away, harming that doesn't just you can't like harm justice. It's like its own form of the good. Bit of hinting as to later. Keep tuned. So yeah, that's about it with Polemarchus. Another one of these come and go people who come, say a few things, and then leave. Then we get Thrasymachus, and Thrasymachus, I have to go off a bit of a tangent here. He's genuinely like the biggest rage baiter I've ever read. Um, okay, maybe like not as much as Socrates in some of his things, but Thrasymachus, like it's so obvious he's not taking his arguments seriously. He's just like spouting. He like kind of locks in on his second half, but his first half is so lazy. He's just like spouting random nonsense, contradicting himself, and he just wants to annoy Socrates. Like, he's just tired of Socrates, like owning his buddies, and he just wants to say random nonsense, some very low hanging fruit. So the first thing he says, oh, is just and I feel like a lot of this is motivated by angst as well. Like you'll see this later later in philosophy with people like Machiavelli who are like, yeah, justice is like oh yeah, justice doesn't mean anything. Yeah, all that stuff. But like the thing is that even like the people who come after Thrasymachus and Socrates, they're giving like good arguments as to why like we shouldn't be just. But Thrasymachus is just like he's not giving good arguments at all. Okay, so his first thing that he says is justice is the advantage of the stronger. Okay, so he's saying like, oh, if I'm being ruled over by a king, then justice is what the king likes. And he makes a good point here. I think one thing that he says is like, oh, if I murder, rob, and cheat people, and I'm just a normal person, I'd get like flamed for that, right? I'd go to jail. But if I'm a king, oh, everyone should respect me because of that, because I'm the king. Whatever just is what I say. Obviously, today that's not how it works, but it is pretty interesting. I do think that is a good point that he made there. But the next, like, also, he's operating under two. He's doing like two things at once. The first thing he says is that justice is like the advantage of the stronger. So like the kings are define justice. But the second thing that he's trying to say, and he's not making it clear, right? I feel like he's really defining justice in two different ways, but he's not making it clear as to the two different ways he's defining it. Because the second thing that he tries to say is that just like unjustness is better than justice. So he's saying like, "Oh, you think it's just to do this, but I think it's unjust to do this." Because and he's saying like he's I think he's kind of trying to say like, "Oh, justice is good, unjustness is bad." And but if you if you're unjust, right? You can get away with all these things, you can get riches, glory. So therefore it's like good to do that. Okay, and that's actually going to be the theme for the rest of the video. But let's go back in. So back on the justice is the advantage of the stronger thing. Socrates will say like, okay, justice is the advantage of the stronger, but rulers can sometimes accidentally like make laws that don't benefit their interest, right? So they're saying like, what if a king purposely restricts his power? Does that mean that is that just or unjust? Okay, I do see Socrates' point there, but I don't. Because like if you're saying, "Oh, justice is the advantage of the stronger," and then you make a counter and saying that rulers make mistakes, then it's not hard to say, "Oh, yeah, but like the ruler meant to make like it doesn't matter because even if the ruler makes the mistakes, it's about what the ruler does and not what the ruler means." So I don't like that doesn't necessarily find anything contradictory with Thrasymachus' argument. But yeah, I do think it does raise a bit of suspicion. But then Thrasymachus, like, he tries to counter it with like this no true Scotsman fallacy. He's like, okay, well, yeah, but that's not a true ruler. A true ruler doesn't make mistakes. And I'm like, come on, man. Like, can we get any more no true Scotsman? Like, and then Socrates is like, oh, okay. This is actually like a pretty interesting argument that Socrates says. He's saying well, everything aims at the good of itself. Right? Medicine serves the body. Equestrianism serves horses. So the rulers serves the ruled. And this is probably the part where Socrates makes the most sense because he's essentially saying, like, the argument is that each field looks after itself and not the subject. So if I think of I don't know. Yeah, if I think of medicine, right? Medicine like the body needs someone to look after it. So that's why you have medicine. You have medicine to look after the body. But who looks after medicine? Socrates says, well, medicine looks after itself. It's self sufficient. So if it's self sufficient, the only thing that its focus is, it's focused on what it's ruling over. And the first time I heard that argument, I was like, okay, is that true though? So I thought about science. So what's the point of science? Science is like, okay, answering and asking questions about the natural world. Fine, right? But science, um, it needs something to look after it, right? So it's not its own thing. It needs stuff to look after it. It needs philosophy to look after it. Because philosophy will resolve, well, it's not going to necessarily resolve, but it needs philosophy in order to like think about all these paradoxes like the problem of induction and it even needs mathematics to a certain extent. It needs logic. It needs all these different things. It needs like probability theory. But with this, so science is inherently, it needs stuff. It's not self sufficient, right? It needs stuff to look after it. But then I was like, okay, but what would Socrates say? Socrates would probably say, well, first of all, it's not like this is like epistemic field. So I think Socrates is more talking about crafts, but different thing. Maybe it's a different thing. But like, what if science? is just a subset of philosophy, where science is not perfectly self sufficient, but that's because philosophy is certainly self sufficient, right? So maybe science is just a subset of philosophy. And the real thing that we should be looking at is philosophy as self sufficient. Because if we think about it, we can't have an ad infinitum of something being sufficient from something else, and that thing being sufficient, and so on and so on. So we have to have like one final thing. And that final thing, we'll just let it beget all the lesser things. So that big thing begets the lesser things. So that we do have something that is perfectly self sufficient. Okay. That was a lot, but yeah, so let's get back. So just a reminder, we're talking about Thrasymachus and about his ruler argument. So then Thrasymachus is like, oh yeah, whatever. So he kind of like changes a little bit. He switches it up, and he actually does make a pretty good argument. He's talking about shepherds. He's saying that shepherds look after their sheep, right? But they're not doing it for their sheep, right? They're just doing it for the money. So it's kind of like a mutual relationship. They benefit the sheep by taking care of it, but the sheep, in a sort of sense, give them their living. It's like a reward, right? Maybe it's an external reward. Maybe it's not quite like a mutual like that, but still, it shows that there is that in which the ruler is necessitated beyond just looking after the good of the subject. And then Socrates says, well, okay, a good ruler, a just ruler, is that in which, what am I saying? The, so the a just ruler is that in which, like, doesn't want to go after office. Like Socrates is saying, like, oh, okay, well, like a truly just ruler, they'd have to like ask him and say like, "Hey, I want you to come to this position," and they're not doing it for the money. They're doing it because they're forced to. They're unhappy in doing it. So basically, that's like the thing reply. Okay, yeah. So basically, it's about saying like, okay, good rulers are reluctant, and I don't think this is necessarily a strong reply because Thrasymachus isn't necessarily talking about a good ruler. He's just talking about a ruler. Like he mentions tyrants a lot. So I think this is just Socrates trying to say like, okay, yeah, well, this is what a good ruler should look like. It's not necessarily addressing Thrasymachus' argument, though. I don't think. Okay. Another thing that he says is that justice is like wisdom, right? So justice is what's wise, and wise is good, right? No one's going to argue that. Thrasymachus is like, yeah. So one thing about this section is that Thrasymachus is just like he really hates Socrates, but then he falls into Socrates' traps way too easily. He always goes, yeah, Socrates, yeah, Socrates, but I have no idea why he doesn't and like say no for once in a while. So yeah, so wise is good, and justice is wise. But then Socrates says, a just man, what does a just man do? A just man tries to outdo the unjust, but the unjust tries to outdo everyone. What do I mean by that? He's saying, like, okay, if I'm a doctor, I don't really care about outdoing. If I'm a doctor, I don't really care about outdoing other doctors. I care about outdoing lay people. And that's the exact issue there. Socrates is saying, okay, if I'm just, I don't care about outdoing other just people. I care about outdoing the unjust people. But unjust people, unjust people, unjust people are the ones who try to outdo everyone. They try to outdo the just people and the unjust people because they're fighting within their ranks. And he's saying, okay, well, if the wise, like the doctors, are not trying to outdo their own kind, they're too wise to do that, then why are the unjust people doing that? Maybe they're not wise. I do think that's kind of like affirming the consequent, though. You're saying like, or yeah, you're saying like, oh, just because two things have a certain property, that therefore that the causation of that property was the same. Not a very strong argument, I don't think. Another thing, I think this is actually a good argument. This actually reminds me of like this one skit I found about these group of robbers going against this philosopher, and the philosopher is essentially trying to say like, oh, look at you, you're unjust towards the world because you're robbing other things. But within your factions, how can you trust yourself to be just within your factions, but not to like rob other things like out in the world, right? So basically, they're saying that if you're unjust, there's a limit. You can't be completely unjust. You have to choose some people who you're just to. And I really like that, right? Because if injustice was truly good, then you expect that the max amount of injustice would be good. If it's truly what separates humanity, you would expect that the max amount of that thing would be beneficial, right? So justice is that's obviously correct, right? Because you have more good, that's more good. But injustice, that shows that complete injustice. If you're completely unjust to everybody, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to be just to some people and injustice to others. And when you have to do that thing that necessarily gets rid of absolutes, that's like, especially in like Greek philosophy, that's a big no-no. Aristotle hasn't come along with his like middle way yet. Okay, what else? Oh yeah, this is a nice one. So another thing that Socrates says is his function argument. He's saying that everything has a function, right? Everything has a function, which is what it does best. So a thing performs its function well, and that's virtuous. So what is that? Yeah, like a function of a musical instrument is to make cool noises. What's the function of a human? The function of a human is justice. The function of the human soul is fulfilling justice to the max possible. So if we want to be happy, he's not saying anything about like, oh, justice is good. He's saying that justice makes you happy because justice fulfills the soul. And that is pretty interesting. And I do think this can be steelmanned a lot because you can say, okay, well, our mind can clearly determine between just and unjust, right? So if our mind can determine between unjust and just, then therefore there's no doubting like if our mind can determine, then that's what our mind is best at. So if that's like fulfilling the mind, that's like fulfilling the soul. And that's what makes you happy. I don't think happy is necessarily like, okay. There's probably like some big fancy smanchy pants Greek word for happy in this case. Like I don't know, eudaimonia. That's probably the word for it. But yeah, I do like that. Yeah, it's about souls. I think souls is something we're gonna get to more in the Republic. But yeah, that's a good argument. That's probably one of the best arguments. Okay, now Thrasymachus leaves. He just dips for some reason. Then we get Glaucon. So Glaucon is like, okay, wait a minute. Thrasymachus was way too complacent. I think he has some good points. So Glaucon, he says, okay, Socrates, there's three goods. The first class of good is you just want the good. So this is just like you just want the pleasure. The second class of good is you want the pleasure, but you also want the consequences of the pleasure. This is like feeling good, right? Or having good health. You want like the pleasure, like feeling good of having good health, and you want like the consequences of like living a long time, being able to be agile and whatnot. And then the third class of good is you only want the consequences, like making money. Socrates says justice is the highest of goods. It's good for both things, so it's class two, good for itself and its consequences. Now, this is like a big fault for Socrates because Glaucon's going to cook him on the consequences. Glaucon says, okay, so where did injustice come from? He's saying man wants to get away with bad things. So that's the best thing. The best thing that could ever happen to man is that he does good and gets away with it, or he does bad and gets away with it. The worst thing that can happen to man is somebody does bad to him, and the person who perpetrated it gets away with it. And then he's saying, okay, what's in between them? It's justice. We live by these rules. We just go along with our day, and we reluctantly follow the law. And yeah, I do think it's a pretty good argument on the origin of justice. I think it's a lot more it's a lot more like like materialist, but it's very pragmatic. It's a very like in pragmatism, it's a pretty good argument. Then we have the Ring of Gyges. I'm sure you guys have heard of this before. He's saying the point of this is power corrupts. Like no one's doubting that. He says, "Oh, if you give a man invisibility, um, they're not going to behave identically. They're going to start robbing things and like killing kings and trying to do power, and no man's not going to get corrupt." Lord of the Rings, been done to death, cliche. Power corrupts, yeah. Then he's saying like, okay, Socrates, you're trying to do this whole reputation thing. This is gonna be what Glaucon's brother is gonna talk about later. But he's saying, Socrates, you're trying to do this reputation thing. But the thing about this reputation is that justice should be good without its reputation. So he's saying, I'm gonna say that you have two men. One is an unjust man, but he gets all the benefits. People think he's just. One is a just man, but he gets like shamed for it. He he doesn't get any goods. He's like treated very poorly. He's beat. He's like very bad. And even the gods like the unjust man better. So basically, he's saying those two things. Who's happier? And at that point, you kind of have to say, well, the unjust man is kind of happier. Glaucon has a very good way of putting it into like this imagery where he like really makes you feel bad for the just person. Beautiful writing there. And then Adeimantus, which is Glaucon's brother, he steps in and saying, wait a minute, I like this. Yeah, there's some really important things that Glaucon hasn't said that. He's saying that it's about the reputation. When we're talking about justice, when we say, oh, justice is good, we're not saying that. We don't actually like being just. We just like the reputation of justice. We like being in good standing. And he also makes a ton of arguments about poetry, and he's saying, "Oh, well, this is even true in poetry." So Adeimantus, he's like weirdly obsessed with Hesiod and Homer. He talks a lot about the gods and poetry. He like the point he tries to make for like half the pages that he's a part of is he's trying to say like, "Oh, we've been taught by like these poets there, and they represent our gods, and they don't teach us to be just." And like, sure, that's fine. I just don't think it holds up in a modern day view. So I'm probably gonna skip a lot of that stuff. Yeah. So then what he's saying is that okay, well, what's the end goal in life? The end goal is to be as unjust as possible, but to make people think we're just as possible. Yeah, this is like related to what the previous guy, Glaucon, had said, is that he's not just saying, oh, well, what if the unjust guy was really popular? He's saying that's our goal. Like, our goal is to be a facade of virtue and to be unjust, like, behind this facade. And, like, what he says is that, like, okay, that's our goal. It's gonna be hard to do that goal, but, like, we have to do that anyway, right? We have to use, like, all this manipulation. Yeah, we have to do all this stuff to you have to do all this stuff to, like, get behind in this facade of virtue. And what he's his next argument is that, like, okay, well, even the gods can be bought. Like, we can do sacrifice. Like, an unjust person can sacrifice a bunch, and he's gonna be viewed more favorably than a just person. But yeah, it's not doesn't really contain any sentiment in the modern day. Okay, and now, what he's essentially saying, the rest is like he's talking about like poets and gods. Basically saying, yo, Socrates, I want you to show me that justice is good beyond its reputation. I want you to show me that, like, why is justice good just for justice? Because if you can show me that the unhappiest or that like the poorest just person in the world is better than like the richest unjust person in the world, that's pretty hard to defend. So yeah, I'm purposely leaving it on a cliffhanger here, because I can't just stop. This discussion goes on for a lot longer. I had to stop somewhere. So yeah, if you enjoyed this, leave a like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next video.